apologies for the uh, portion that we missed. But I know we have some notes being taken if anybody needs to look back at the last hour. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I've also been taking notes. Um, Sorry to not remind you of that at the beginning.
Thanks for explaining that, Garrett.
Yeah, you're welcome. So in the last meeting, we did have some discussion around dredge material disposal and whether the county and other local governments should endeavor to update the dredge material disposal plan, which is like an extra document that's part of the Columbia River Estuary Management Plan. It was updated, it was created around 1979, updated with the rest of the estuary management plan around 1986, and then last updated in 2002. And we had a discussion with a technical advisory committee discussion in November around whether or not the local governments should endeavor to update that dredge material disposal plan, which would serve as sort of your comprehensive plan amendment. It would make new sites eligible that are potentially useful, right? And then you would have to go through you would still have to go through a separate permit process to utilize it. And the planning director would have to make findings about your particular disposal at the site that you want to use. And sort of the outcome of that discussion in November was that for a few reasons, it seems like going forward, the local governments should not be trying to do comprehensive updates of the dredge material management plan. And the reasons I'm recalling are that when the dredge material management plans were done in the past, there were more resources available to do them, and they aspired to update them every 5 years to keep them relevant to the dredge material disposal needs in the estuary. And even in that era, they couldn't keep up with 5-year update cycles. And so the plans become outdated, and it becomes you end up having to do a comprehensive plan amendment anyway as an applicant to update the dredge material management plan. And so the idea going forward is that will not happen, and it is a bit it's I don't think in reality it reflects like a change in the status quo on what applicants have to do. It's a recognition of a reality that has been the case for some time. All right. So we have about an hour left that we could use to go into goal 18, but I also feel like in some of the past meetings we've spent more time on goal 18. And so if anyone wants to keep talking about this or other goal 16 estuary issues, let's do it. Jeff?
Yeah, thanks. On that last point you just made about the county dredge material management plan, I appreciate the points you're making. My question would be, there is this table in the back of the county version of the DMMP that goes site by site and has some additional kind of little caveats and addendums to, if you're going to use this site, stay inside this fence. Or if you're going to use that site, don't place more than 3 million cubic yards in any 5-year period. Are those still valuable to keep and memorialize somewhere as county standards on use of existing sites? Is there a place that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're like some of them are more useful than others, and we just to be honest, like don't have we're not able to evaluate each one completely right now to determine how useful it is. And that's going to be the case for some of the existing management unit policies too. That like without a full estuary management plan update and like a detailed review of each management unit's conditions and honestly, time for us to talk about them as an advisory committee. I mean, this is why why it took a few years in some other communities to update an estuary management plan, is sort of getting down to that level of granularity of evaluating whether or not old policies for a particular location are really still useful. So, in terms of our draft right now, it doesn't include those, but perhaps it should, and that they're there, and the county could determine that they're not applicable on a case by case basis um, during the permit review, for example. But I don't know, or we're open to your input on what to do about that.
I think the question would be, at what point does it become enforceable that there are these additional site restrictions? And if there's a permit, then that can obviously be, or to me, it would seem that county staff could look back at this prior plan, notice that at the time it was important to stay inside the fence, and then in the present day say, well, is that fence still there? Do we think that's still important? Great, we'll put that as a condition on our permit. It's a little bit different when you have a federal agency that doesn't need to get a permit, but there should still be a way to use this past information as interpretive guidance to say, in the present day, in order to remain consistent with our estuary management plan and goal 16, we want you to stay inside the fence. I mean, there's a little bit of gray area there, but I appreciate the challenge that you have of trying to find an appropriate home for some of these kind of onesie twosie additional thoughts and requirements for sites.
Yeah. Just taking a couple notes here.
Like, are you updating the sub area narratives? I know there's information being taken out of narratives, but like, could there be a one sentence to say there is an existing identified dredge material site in this sub area, and any material placement in that area has got to stay inside the fence? And so you kind of incorporate it in the sub area policy and don't have to keep it in a separate location.
Yeah, I was just thinking that that might be like we could just transfer them into the management units. Because most of the other policy, or it seems like all of the other policies about how dredge material is supposed to occur that's in the dredge material management plan, like that is already reflected in the main body of county policy. Like it's copied there, and then the whole DMMP is referred to as adopted by reference. And then we also have the dredge material disposal site overlay zone, which is supposed to capture the spatial element of
Mhm.
sites that are part of the DMMP. And so it might be that capturing those site-specific policies, bringing them into the management unit section, that might be like the final thing that would be needed to sort of no longer reference that whole plan, and sort of and move on from it in some ways. It's just
And then
initial.
looking forward, as new sites get added, where would you put policies? Probably in that same location, right? If there are
Yeah,
any.
within the management units, yeah. And they'd be part of the dredge material disposal site overlay. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Annie's curious about what kind of information. Sorry, this is maybe getting to be. Oh no, this is a new comment. What kind of information is in the informational narratives that are being removed from the management unit sections of the goal 16 and 17 policies? So um, it's information on existing aquatic uh, habitats and resources, and existing shoreland uses and resources. And there's a little description on sort of management issues and potential conflicts as of 1988 or so, for each management unit, and what was important to the writers at that time. It's sort of what they saw as being sort of the near term things that needed to be thought about. And so um, that information, some of that information is going to continue to be useful potentially, but it's also just it's like one part of the puzzle of understanding a site, we think, along with referring to new data sources. And going forward, we're not proposing to replace those narratives within the plan. And it would be more up to applicants to use the updated inventory resources we're providing um, to piece together what's there and describe what's there and how they could impact it. So, Annie?
Yeah, so I guess the clarifying question for me is in the discussion about future estuary management plan updates, that like updating the narratives was on the list. And so I'm curious, like, so if it's removed from the comprehensive plan, the narratives would still be in the estuary management plans themselves, so that information would still be retained until those estuary management plans are updated, right? So those,
Oh
would
yeah.
that used?
Yeah, the estuary management plans would be like directly referenced background documents that applicants are supposed to refer to um, when they're designing their project and writing an impact assessment, for example.
Right,
And
exactly. I mean, I just think that it does have value to retain that information, even if it's outdated, to help with the impact assessment process and to better understand what's there. At least I think it's important to retain it too in the interim until the estuary management plans are updated with new resource inventory information and a new narrative can be crafted around climate change and everything. So I guess I'm a little concerned about the information being completely scratched from the comp plan unless there's like, I don't know, unless it's like very explicitly referenced, like look at the estuary management plan for more detailed information.
okay. Um, any other thoughts on that from anybody else? We'll talk about it with the team, Annie, and see if it makes sense to just keep all of that. It's the interest was just to find opportunities to make the document shorter, but
Mm.
doesn't have to be an overriding concern necessarily.
Yeah, and I guess there has been discussions about this kind of thing in the past in surrounding the Quinta Bay Estuary Management Plan. And originally those narratives were crafted so that other state agencies could also use it when making permit decisions. Um,
Mm,
and I'm not sure how often other agencies like DSL and ODFW like use that information anymore now that it's quite outdated, but that was at least the original intent.
mm.
So I wouldn't want to like scratch that information and then have gaps that other agencies would have to find information and fill, you know. If it's retained in some way, I think it's okay, but um just want to flag that.
Okay. All right. Well, anything else on estuary management before we move to discussing goal 18? So for goal 18, some of the public and stakeholder input that we've gotten definitely centered around climate change impacts, because we sort of led with that topic and asking for input. But the input emphasized, resilience in beach and dune systems, and the ability for the resources to adapt over time. There's a few areas of the policies and standards that we're gonna be thinking about climate change impacts. One is in standards about how uses can and can't occur when they are permitted. The role of the geologic hazard report is really important here. And then there's also some recommended actions that the county should consider taking going forward after the plan update. We also, again, because we led on these topics and the project was scoped to specifically address them, got input around cable landings and a lot of concern about potential impacts from those, and on erosion control. And then we've heard from y'all quite a bit about improving, or at least ensuring, that interagency coordination continues going forward. And so we'll review a few policies around that as well. So some of the input we got was that the current policies and standards don't include provision, or don't allow or say one way or the other whether ecological restoration projects are permitted in the beach and dune environment. And the general idea typically is that if something's if it doesn't say that it's permitted, then it's not permitted. And so the draft proposes to add ecological restoration projects as a permitted use. Am I sharing? No, I'm not even sharing. I'll start sharing my screen. One sec. Sorry, guys. Okay, so adding ecological restoration projects as a permitted use, and acknowledging that will oftentimes include like removing and replacing one vegetation community with another, and that can also involve some grading. And that if the project is part of like an established plan from a conservation, like ODFW, or from a conservation agency or organization like a land trust conservation project, or a watershed association conservation project, then those kinds of activities should be permitted uses. And there are some standards that we proposed as well to go along with that, to address potential impacts on surrounding areas. We also heard some concern that from stakeholders in our public meeting over the weekend, for example, that many applicants would potentially try to abuse the fact that ecological restoration projects are a permitted use, and try to use that to just do their, achieve whatever goals they have for view grading, or removing vegetation that gets in the way of their views, or that they don't like for some other reason. And so we're thinking about whether there's anything else that's needed to make it clearer that, like, what kinds of situations that applies to. We're also proposing in the draft to make projects that heighten dunes for flood and tsunami risk mitigation permitted uses. And that was a concept that I think Dogami staff raised a few months ago. And so we incorporated that. And then in the interest of actually providing incentives to implement the state land use goal and local preference for non-structural erosion control. We were proposing to make non-structural erosion control like vegetation, like new vegetation, a permitted use. So we're interested in your input on that, and whether we need to rethink any of these and actually have there be like if any of them you think need to be review uses with a planning director decision and written findings made on them. Laurel?
Do you have a definition of that type of, you said a vegetative structure? Do you have a definition or something that would expand on what types of structures would count?
Sorry, yeah, I didn't use the word structure. So it'd be vegetative erosion control, and we aren't proposing like a unique definition for that. But we could, and we would use, state of Oregon's erosion control guidance to do it. What kind of situations are you thinking about where that could go wrong?
I guess it would, I mean, I'd ask Rhiannon to weigh in here, but if it is a structure that's made with vegetation or enhanced by vegetation, there's a difference between eligibility for goal 18 versus not eligible, depending on whether it's structural. So there are sometimes structures that are enhanced by vegetation, but they're not solely vegetative.
Right.
In
Yeah,
their
like
nature, riprap with
Yep.
vegetation added to it, for example, or some sort of hybrid structure, but not fully vegetation, but not just riprap.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
I'm
we'll
sure,
take a look at that.
sure
That
Meg
makes
and
sense.
Rhiannon could have some feedback on that, but without a definition, then it opens that, door to what is and what isn't qualified.
I can chime in too. I appreciate that, Laurel. I think that's a really good point. And we do it in the erosion control guide, which I think you just referenced, Garrett. We do have a definition, a suggested one anyway. And I think it's kind of like you can define it by what it is not. So like saying that it is not riprap or a seawall or, like that kind of stuff. And it does in our definitions, I think there is that part. Like it gives examples, like it includes, but is not limited to, like these things are structural, and it includes, but not limited to, these things are non-structural. But I do really like the idea of us incentivizing non-structural solutions by like making them a permitted use and having the permitting burden be less for those, because that is what we're trying to encourage people to do. So I appreciate that.
All right, thanks, Meg. I have a note here to take a look at that definition and see if we have one that's conflicting or if we should just include it there. Graham?
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. That's great news. I was just thinking maybe if working with state parks, because I know they're doing some, experimentation on native species to help with dune stabilization. I'm just thinking maybe if there was some language or even a plant list that could say, if you're gonna remove vegetation, you have to, install native vegetation or some sort of way in which people wouldn't abuse, or if they were going to try to use that, restoration enhancement language, they would be kind of segued into having to, add certain vegetation types in that are native, because I feel like, yeah, removing Scotch broom or even topsoil removal, which is being done by the North Coast Land Conservancy in some areas on the dunes, could be where native vegetation is being, replanted because it does better in those historic soils that are down lower, below the nitrogen layer there that the Scotch broom has established, could be something that could just really help facilitate, kind of putting some guidance in what is restoration enhancement in the dunes, because it is a unique system and unique to our county.
All right. You referenced, did you reference a particular plant list we should take a look at?
feel like state parks would probably be the best guidance on that. You know, I've talked to Noel, and I know that Ian Silvernail from USDA has been doing some work with like dune tansy and some other native species. I can go digging a little bit, but I think that'd probably be a state parks question. Feel free to chime in, anybody there.
All right, well, we can follow up, but if they have anything else, Laurel Laurel, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, we've been working with Sea Grant on a potential future document about this topic, but part of the problem is the availability of the materials for in the quantities that would be needed for like private property uses, the restoration, the types of native plants. But we are partnering with OSU and some other folks on some research on the types of species that might work in these type of situations, but there's still a lot of work to do before there's like a obvious list to share. But it is something that we're working on with Sea Grant and a bunch of other partners, some of which are in this meeting, knowing that that's a need and something that's desired by both restoration partners and private property owners is, what works other than non-native species.
And I should caveat with saying we're working on actually amplifying a lot of those native species with some of our growers who are, growing these plants locally and trying to get it because oftentimes there is a challenging nexus between private lands and available native plants. So we're actively trying to create that not only demand but also availability with some of our growers in the area. So yeah, good opportunity, I think, for a local economy.
All right. Well, thanks for that input. And any more ideas on it are welcome. Any other thoughts on uses being considered permitted uses or review uses or conditional uses? We had a little discussion on the distinction between those earlier in the meeting, and I saw that someone had asked in the chat if we have a description of what each one means: permitted, review, conditional. So the Clatsop County's policies and its land and water development use ordinance describe that distinction, and it's like laid out very formally in terms of what each permit process entails. And it's based in state law and basic planning principles. And I'm not sure if we'd want to repeat that again, like in every plan element, 1 through 19. But if your question was about, can we provide it to you in this meeting? But if you want me to explain that a little bit more right now, is that what anybody here wanted, to describe conditional uses versus permitted uses?
I was just thinking it would be helpful for like somebody reviewing the documents to know what the implications are of the changes. And it doesn't have to be
Right.
at every section, just having it obviously available instead of somebody having to dig through and try and figure it out.
Great.
Might be helpful.
Okay. Good idea. And just to be clear, beachfront protective structures would not be permitted uses. But we got your input that we should look at our definitions and make sure that we're not opening a loophole. Okay, so another draft change is expanding the preference hierarchy, you might say, for which kinds of erosion control and mitigation should be used in the beach and dune environment. And currently, Clatsop County has this hierarchy where less impactful, less permanent methods are preferred to beachfront protective structures, reflecting state goal 18. But we had talked about expanding the sort of list of things that are included in each of these categories. And this is where we've landed so far. And we wanted to see if you had any initial thoughts on whether this seems right. I think just a couple of things that are notable is that we, in sort of like the highest preference action, are not distinguishing between something as simple as maintaining existing vegetation versus projects that can be quite substantial and involve site impacts in their own right, like relocating a structure. And then we've included a few methods in sort of the least preferred position that I think are technically not even beachfront protective structures necessarily, but they come with some predictable or difficult to control impacts with the materials that are used degrading relatively quickly and becoming sort of trash on the beach. I'm not sure if they're really permitted anymore anyway by OPRD, but any input here?
Sorry, can you hear me, Garrett?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I appreciate you kind of adjusting this a little bit. I mean, I think we talked before that kind of lines up with where the OPRD kind of alternative decision making comes, and I like that. But I was also wondering in there if part of it being like 4 has just riprap is even having things like hybrid being as a preference where it's riprap with vegetation or tow rock with vegetation or things of that nature, because we do vegetation in of itself isn't actually something that's going to probably be sufficient in most cases. It may help slow the erosion rate and be kind of a first step of things, but it also could help to move from just being solid rock to hey, maybe 50% of it or whatever is covered with some sort of vegetation, or applicants start with tow rock instead of a full revetment or something of that nature. So just thinking that might be a way to kind of build in, and that also builds into what the erosion control guide kind of talks about as well. So kind of that hybrid piece is kind of what is in the middle that could at least be maybe added for clarification.
Great. Yeah, that's helpful. We currently actually riprap is, I think, required to be vegetated when it is installed in Clatsop County, but there's not standards around that in terms of like what's like practical or what would be washed away right away anyway. But I think that, yeah, distinguishing that even when you're doing riprap, like some of these other things, if you can protect the riprap itself a little bit with some dynamic protection or using vegetation as much as possible, that's a higher level in the preference hierarchy. And the way that gets implemented is that when the geologic hazard report documents the need for erosion control for the county to decide on whether to issue a permit, they're supposed to evaluate higher preference alternatives and whether they would be helpful and feasible before they settle on a lower preference alternative. And so specifying that here could be meaningful, it seems like.
Yeah,
Right.
and one of the other things that'll make it kind of compatible too is, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, one of the other things that helps too is like one of our review criteria relates to blending in with the surroundings or being compatible with the surroundings, those type of things. And so that's part of one of the techniques that we're going to be looking at trying to incorporate as we move forward a little bit more heavily. And that's part of why this planting guide and some other things need to come forward first, because we can't tell people to plant stuff if we don't even know what will survive in the that interface zone.
Is the planting guide is that like certain and imminent enough that it's worth referencing, and you think it would be reasonable to reference it in county policy, that it's like an anticipated thing that should be referred to by in the geologic hazard report, for example? Or is it you're not sure when that will be done or what it'll even be called, really?
I would say it's imminent, but the question is, it's probably going to be somewhere in the next year or two. So when,
Okay.
and we're based on OSU's capacity and the group's capacity to kind of kick everything together. So,
Okay.
but it's definitely getting some life. I don't know if anybody else on the call that's part of that work group has any other thoughts on that, but I know that we're hoping in the next couple of years to have something out.
All right. Okay. Let's see here. So in terms of geologic hazard report requirements, this is really how the county staff or the planning commission, when it's a conditional use permit, get the information that they need to make an informed decision. The applicant the applicant's geologist writes a geologic hazard report that describes existing conditions, why the action is needed, how they're going to protect, if it's a building that's being built in the dune environment, how it's going to be protected from erosion. If it's an erosion control structure, why it's the erosion control structure that's the best one to use, and why less impactful methods can't be used, for example. And there's currently requirements in the county policies and zoning ordinance to have a geologic hazard report. And so the draft proposal includes more extensive requirements for these reports. And it's really like a couple pages worth of additional requirements that are specific to the beach and dune environment. And they closely reflect at the recommendation of some of you in prior meetings, the requirements from Tillamook County. I mean, and those requirements seemed like they're fairly thorough in making sure that the report is describing the site itself, adjacent areas, the beach in front of the site, that the current erosion and flooding trends are being described, that forecasted changes based on sea level rise are being considered, and how whatever they're doing is they expect to perform under those future conditions as well. And so this is one of the main ways that the policy update is responding to anticipated climate change impacts as well. Laurel?
Yeah, since we don't have the language in front of us, does it just say sea level rise as far as like future sort of forecasting impacts? Because there are other climate change related impacts besides that, work in tandem with the sea level rise. And I'm just wondering, you just mentioned the sea level rise.
Yeah.
There are other impacts from that affect future beach erosion.
Let me double check, see if I can pull it up. 1 second.
Or just something to look into, just making sure that there's like more sort of comprehensive language about the climate change forecasting.
Yeah. So you're thinking about like wave energy, potentially, or maybe where there's a stream crossing the beach and dune environment down to the ocean, like that changes to how that interacts with waves and sea level would be considered.
Yeah, just that whatever information that they're using is, the best available information for forecasting that future erosion trends. It's hard
Okay.
to say what's going to be available in the future, but yeah.
Okay. Um, Absolutely. I'm almost able to answer your question. I'm kind of curious just to see and remind myself. Okay, we'll move on. This document's a bit bulky. Okay, so okay, so finally, there's a recommendation to keep updating goal 18 references to new beach and dune geomorphology assessments and climate change and sea level rise forecasts. I guess this speaks a little bit to what you're talking about, Laurel, but it's more general than that. And it's applied to the county, basically aspiring to keep incorporating, it doesn't have to be a huge process to do it, but to keep referencing updated studies and data sets that applicants can use to inform their projects. And then, going all the way back to the 1970s, the last report or comprehensive report on the Clatsop Plains aquifer that we found identified salinity intrusion into the aquifer as a potential concern, and goal 18 is concerned with groundwater resource protection. And some of Clatsop County's other comprehensive plan elements have recently identified Clatsop Plains aquifer salinity intrusion as a potential concern. It's logically something that we should be concerned about. And so just recommending that if there's opportunities to do an actual technical analysis um, of when and whether the Clatsop Plains aquifer could be impacted by sea level rise, so that we can say more than just having sort of a general concern about it, that is something that the county should participate in if the state would assist. Sorry, this is a lot. But for cable landings, we've talked about cable landings a fair amount. In the last two meetings, we talked more about the kinds of impacts that stakeholders were concerned about with cable landings. And so just to review some of the draft policies around cable landings, there'd be some prohibition areas. And these are the prohibition areas that are in the draft based on stakeholder input, but we are continuing to evaluate these, and they might change a little bit. But keeping cable landings away from residential uses, wetlands, riparian areas, and outside of public parks. And then, so there's sort of a spatial element to it. of they're not allowed in some places. And then the rest of it is mostly procedural in terms of what's required in an application and what it needs to describe. And so just that the county's intention is for cable landing projects to be permitted through a unified process that considers the whole cable route through the beach and dune environment and outer coastal shorelands instead of sort of like one component at a time. That what's described in the application is what's approved. It doesn't necessarily need to be said, but cable landings have a tendency to attract additional cable and or for sites to be added onto. And so just being clear that what's described in the application is what's being approved and that additional modifications require new approvals. Pre-application conference required with several state agencies. They're listed here. And that both temporary construction impacts and post-construction impacts are considered in the application process, and that the application include plans responding to sinkholes and inadvertent releases of drilling fluids. One thing I meant to mention at the beginning was that where potentially allowed, cable landings would be considered a conditional use permit. So that's a decision that's made by the Planning Commission after public notice, opportunities for testimony, including a public hearing. And so we're interested in getting your feedback here. And there's not, the actual policies as they're written in the draft policies and the draft ordinance aren't a whole lot longer than this. Like other activities in the beach and dune environment, they rely on the geologic hazard report to sort of specify and provide a lot of the important information that's needed for decision making. And also in the case of conditional uses, with any conditional use, there's decision criteria about impacting surrounding areas, whether or not the use is appropriate for the site, considering what's there and things of that nature. So we didn't provide pages and pages trying to specify how particular aspects of cable landings are supposed to occur. It's mostly process oriented with these prohibition areas. Yeah, so any input here? And we have covered this fairly well in prior meetings, it feels like, but I'm also curious to know if anyone's heard of the cable landing that exists in Warrenton already at DeLaura Beach Road. I think it's about 10 years old. And we've learned a little bit about it in the last month, but haven't been able to find like news coverage of issues or things that went wrong with that one. So it was so far refreshing to find an example of one that didn't feel like as much of a problem as some of the others that have occurred. Laurel?
I put it in the chat, but I was just pointing out that it would be great to invite, I don't know if they have the capacity to be involved, but ODFW and Dogami to the early conversations if they're able or interested. They've been involved in the previous ones and some of their input has been invaluable. So just putting a plug in there. I don't know if they have capacity, but an invite maybe, or ask them. I don't think anybody's on the call, so.
Yeah, thank you. I thought we had actually included them in our code, our ordinance update. Maybe in translating it. We'll double check. I might have just lost it in translating to PowerPoint, but we'll make sure they're included there. Okay. Am I missing anything else in the chat right now? Okay.
Hey.
Someone.
Garrett,
Yeah.
Garrett, were you moving on? I'm kind of getting pulled in a couple different directions on the other side here, but were you moving on to other topics that maybe hadn't been covered, or are you still on the cable crossing or pipeline crossings, cable crossings?
We were just finishing up with cable landings. So if there's
Okay.
something you want to weigh in on there, then absolutely.
No, I'll weigh on. I had another thing at the end.
Okay.
Right. Oh, right.
All right. Looks like I got something misaligned here on my slide, but in terms of erosion, additional erosion control related policies, aside from what's required, the additional requirements for a new geologic hazard report, the policies are referencing Dogami's updated geomorphology data that is anticipated to be published in 2025, that describes the beach and dune environment, largely in terms of stability, also in terms of erosion risk and the presence of wetlands as well. And so currently, the Clatsop County relies on a construction setback line that's established as a distance from the statutory vegetation line. And that's established in a couple of goal exceptions for the Surf Pines and Pinehurst communities. And so going forward, those construction setback lines would still be minimums, but in addition to that, where development is proposed, the Dogami geomorphology data would also need to be referred to understand if what's being proposed is in an area that's considered an active foredune, for example, or recently stabilized dune, or in any of the other dune classifications where residential, commercial, and industrial development are prohibited. And the data would also be useful for informing any other number of activities in the beach and dune environment as well, and should be used for that. So we've reviewed a few of these. There's just different ways of organizing the changes, but expanded geologic hazard report requirements, adding additional particular methods to the erosion mitigation hierarchy. We talked about that. And then there are some additional standards that we've added for non-beachfront protective structure erosion control methods. So things like dynamic revetments, for example, can have their own impacts on the beach and dune environment. And so they would need a geologic hazard report anyway, but there are some new standards that require consideration of how beach and dune users and beach and dune resources could be impacted, and avoiding those impacts. Finally, we have had some extra discussion in the last meetings about coordination with OPRD. The county currently has policies and a standard in its ordinance requiring that development in the ocean shore be coordinated with OPRD. But we're sort of strengthening and reiterating that sentiment in a few different ways here. So based on some lessons in other communities on cable landings, and your input, there's some new requirements for pre-application conference. We just talked about that. For also for commenting and continued coordination through implementation of constructing a cable landing. If anyone were ever to propose doing a four-dune grading plan for views in Clatsop County, which we haven't heard of any proposals to do that, we have a draft policy requiring that the plan is consistent with the Ocean Shore Management Plan. And that's something that is just intended to let if anyone ever wants to do one of these, to let them know that in order for the grading to ever get permitted on after the grading plan is done, it needs to be consistent with the Ocean Shore Management Plan. So it's a way of helping people potentially make sure that the grading plan effort is actually useful going forward. And we're not sure that that'll ever be relevant anyway, but perhaps it will. Yeah, so maintaining the existing county policy to coordinate with OPRD and the Ocean Shore. And then we have a recommended action to participate in any OPRD efforts to create reach or literal cell-based spatial plans for the Ocean Shore as well. This all comes out of our conversations and past meetings. Okay, so finally, just wanted to cover a little bit on the new Dogami beach and dune geomorphology data. It includes it's GIS data that describes the beach and dune environment and relates their geomorphology classifications to in the right three columns to the goal 18 beach and dune categories in the left-hand column. And so, or excuse me, in the goal 18 column is second from right, I think. My material here is covering up the heading, but so this is new, more fine-grained and more accurate data on beach and dune stability and characteristics that should be considered during permit reviews. And it'll be required that geologic hazard reports refer to it and that decisions on residential, commercial, and industrial uses be informed by it. Again, Dogami's planning on publishing this in 2025, along with a report that describes the data. And they have said that if you're familiar at all with the study that was done for Tillamook County, that the methods and dune classifications are exactly the same as were done in Tillamook County. All right. Is there anything else that anyone wants to weigh in on from the last several minutes or earlier in the meeting?
Yeah, Garrett, it's Kevin. I just wanted to kind of ask for clarification. I think you might have said it when you were talking about the erosion or some of the geo-report piece, but one of the things we had talked about was some of the actual setbacks and how those are coupled to the statutory vegetation line currently, and how maybe going forward there may, as we potentially adjust that over time or with any updates, and that it's maybe not the most appropriate basis for the setback line. I just was curious if that is what you meant when you were talking about kind of the geology report and the erosion hazard and that, or if there was something additional that you had a feedback on that on.
Yeah, so so currently, like north of Gearhart, the construction setback line is established through goal exceptions for existing platted areas in Surf Pines and Pinehurst. And then outside of those areas, so far from what I've been able to tell, there's not, it's, I think it's 573 feet, east of the statutory vegetation line. And so that would remain like a minimum distance. In Arch Cape, south of Cannon Beach, there's not a construction setback line that's specified in the code or the policies. And so outside of the goal exceptions and north of Gearhart, we'd have that minimum distance. Plus, if there's active foredune landward of that distance, that would also be that you wouldn't be allowed to build in an active foredune if that's what the updated data says. So it's like both of them are minimums, you could say. The existing construction setback line and then the beach and dune geomorphology data on top of that. But we haven't talked since our prior TAC meeting about increasing the construction setback line, the minimum construction setback line distance. It would just be like, there's that distance and you need to refer to the beach and dune geomorphology data.
Okay, and I guess I bring that up just because we have, and I'm thinking it was actually in the county jurisdiction, they all start running together, but I know we've had some times where there's been new development being proposed and effectively they come in saying, well, we need to do shoreline armoring in order to build, and that's not necessarily how everything ties together. And so it's part of it is looking at that, making sure that setback line, I guess, is just adequate to prevent as new development occurs, that it's not forcing, other decisions to be made, I guess, or potentially putting homes in risk, in a short duration because they're kind of within that expected erosion area. And so I guess that's kind of where I'm bringing that up, is just the statutory vegetation line is not only is it over 50 years old, it's not really a good representation of that threat or that kind of, I'll say, the reality on the ground. So
okay, we'll take another look at it. I mean, I'm trying to we've actually struggled to find examples of where areas that aren't already built, that where the question becomes really important, or where where platting and subdivision decisions haven't already been made.
mm-hmm.
So, but we'll take another look and think about that.
Yeah, so I said, where I'm seeing it is more on new structures, or if there's been subdivisions or subdivided parcels, prior, or that happened maybe on Goal 18 eligible parcels that are now coming in, and then they're basically saying, hey, to build here we have to do this. And so again, it's one of those of how do we make sure there's people are coming in, and when they're building, they're not instantly kind of being thrust into that threat of erosion right off the bat. I mean, obviously existing development's one thing, but it's the new development, I guess. And it's kind of that, I'll say, stop the bleed thought, and just kind of giving that recommendation, because it is something we do see. And that's honestly a really hard dialogue to have with people, because it's like from the ocean shore side, it can be difficult to justify a need for shoreline protection if you don't actually have a structure there. And so it kind of becomes this circular discussion. And it's like, well, the county says I can build, but then you're telling me, and I can build, but I need to have, say, some sort of protection. But then we're telling them, well, it's going to be really tough to justify actually the protection. And so it really puts them in kind of this loop. So again, it just as a thought for consideration as you guys are going forward, that might also help with in the future, if there's any sort of dialogues about managed retreat or anything like that, why it's not, hey, how come I just built my house 2 years ago and now you're telling me I should look at managed retreat? It's at least basing that on the threat to that property. So anyhow, just thought I'd throw that out there, and hopefully in the future we'll have better erosion prediction data in that as well. I know OSU's and Doug Amy have worked on some stuff, but that's at least preliminary. But hopefully we can get that refined over the next few years, and you guys can use that to, you know, in future updates. But just starting to plant that seed, I guess.
All right.
And then,
Yeah, thanks, Kevin.
the other piece I wanted to put on the statutory vegetation line, that I don't think I got to share before, because I think this is something that's happened since we started having these TAC meetings. There is new datum being used for basically for the survey points, and the reference points and the survey data that was used for the statutory vegetation line in some cases can be extremely difficult to recreate. We are currently embarking on, because we just discovered this in the last few months, we are currently embarking on a program to figure out what does that actually mean and what our options are to reestablish the 1967 boundary, but have been kind of at least preliminarily advised that there may be certain areas that don't have control points and you know, survey markers and that, to where we could actually recreate a specific point. And so that does make it a challenge, and that makes it not only a challenge for us, but also, you know, if you're using that that line as a setback marker, if that line is not able to be recreated by a surveyor, that then kind of puts us again all in this weird mix of what do we do? For us, jurisdictionally, it's not necessarily as big of an issue, because in most of those cases, the beach has eroded further east, so it's jurisdictional. But if your setback's paired to that statutory vegetation line, it could make it quite difficult in some locations, just because there may not be survey data for that stretch, and until a surveyor actually goes out there and looks at it, we may not know whether it can be recreated. And so again, that's where we're initially looking right now. So again, I wanted to bring that up because that does bring a reality out there. Yes, it's codified in statute. Yes, there are actual points, but we're being informed that it may be difficult in some sections for us to adequately establish where it's at with precision. So,
Is that like precision in feet or tens of feet?
We've only gotten preliminary information right now, but the way I understand it is effectively the control points used in many cases were along 101, and those have, in over the almost 60 years, a lot of those have disappeared. And so again, we don't know the scope or scale. I'm just speaking in kind of this generalities right now, that certain locations, but then there's other places like I'll say Gearhart, just because I know they're out there. There are actual fence posts that were surveyed in to demarcate that line that still exists, and so those areas will be very easy to recreate. So So just as a kind of to help you guys look at that forward too, because I'd hate for you to rely on something that we have, and then if it takes us 2-3 years to reestablish that coast-wide, and somebody comes in and goes, well, we can't meet this because Parks doesn't actually have the data for that spot. Yeah, it's something that apparently it's coming around, and with some of the datum changes again in 28, and those will be like 4 or 5 datums out, because ours is based on, I think it's 1927 datum, if I remember correctly, going from memory. So yeah, we're just getting outdated, and that's what we're looking at, is how do we update it and make it real again.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, all sorts of fun things.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, we are past time now, so for those of you that are left, thanks for sticking with us past the end, and we will try to share everything we've done with you as soon as we can. And you're also welcome to reach out in the meantime if you have any follow-up thoughts in the coming days as well. And you have David's contact information, at least from this meeting invite, and you can reach out to either of us. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Garrett. Yeah, if anybody needs my contact information for whatever reason, I will put it in the chat real quick and you can grab it from there. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for sticking around a little bit past time, and we look forward to working with you again. Thanks.
I'll send you my notes.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, y'all. All right. Have a good day.
Yeah, we'll see you. Bye.